If there is no progress, we could just walk away. There's certainly no mood for compromise from Britain as the government set out its plan for the Brexit talks, which begin on Monday in Brussels with the EU. The British team will tell the EU that they want a free trade agreement on similar terms to Canada. The core demand is that the UK should have control of its own laws and political life, with absolutely no role for the European Court of Justice. And they threaten that if a broad outline of a deal isn't clear by June, they could walk out and focus solely on getting ready for Britain's exit from the transition at the end of this year. That would mean trading with the EU on WTO terms. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
2 days after the EU negotiation plan, the UK one has landed on the negotiating table. And before the two sides even sit at the table, right at the front of the UK document, a threat to walk away as soon as June, if Britain feels there isn't sufficient progress in the talks. At the heart of the disagreement between these two outlooks, European Union concern that post-Brexit, Britain could start producing goods on the cheap, maybe even with state aid. Europe doesn't want a giant competitor on its doorstep, and repeatedly in here makes reference to wanting a level playing field. There are 13 mentions of that phrase in here, not one in here.
The whole objective of doing what we're doing is so the UK can do things differently and better. But the crucial thing for our friends and partners to understand is that we don't. This is a great country with the highest possible standards for the environment, for animal welfare, for social protection, for workers' rights. Of course, we're not going to engage in some race to the bottom.
The UK document repeatedly says it wants the EU to do for Britain what it did in trade deals with Japan, South Korea and Canada, in full knowledge that the EU sees it very differently and wants to make sure that if Britain diverges big time from EU rules, it gets punished big time in terms of trade restrictions and tariffs. Trade talks are normally all about moving closer to each other's way of doing things. This one is about giving Britain the power to do things differently.
So they are miles apart. They know they'll need to compromise, but they're not really sure what that compromise looks like because their future, that divergence, isn't so clear. Whereas traditionally in trade negotiations, you know what you're aiming for.
Throughout the process, the EU has said, we can give you a deal like Canada, it's just we're going to ask more of you. And then it's fine if the UK says, well, that's not fair, that's not fair. To be honest, the EU don't care if it's fair or not. They've made their mind up.
In the Commons, Michael Gove was asked whether Britain would actually move away from EU rules.
There isn't the danger here that, having made this choice, the government imposes economic consequences for the long term on the country in pursuit of the prize of a sovereignty which it ends up not using very much because at the end of the day, good standards in environmental and labour market and consumer sectors actually makes sense.
I do take his point, and it will be for this Parliament and for future Parliaments to decide how our sovereignty is exercised in accordance with the wish of the British people.
The government now openly acknowledges its approach means border delays and costs, and those costs will be even greater if no deal is agreed on the future relationship.
It is a negotiation, though. You will have to make some concessions. Do you accept that?
No.
At the beginning, you would expect a tough line, absolutely no compromise at all. But in the end, it always is a compromise. The question is, who's going to compromise more?
And if we look at the recent history, what we've seen on the table is the UK has compromised quite a lot and the EU has compromised a little. Let's see if that pattern continues.
Number 10 tonight, a reception ahead of St David's Day. A government note to Tory MPs warned them not to use the phrase no deal. Depending on the progress of the talks starting next week, businesses could be staring at that prospect again a few months from now.